Harvard University, they've done it again. Last year, I reported on the story about Harvard University refusing to give Cornel West tenure. Now, why did they refuse to do that? Because Cornel West was vocal about his support of the Palestinian struggle. So this goes back to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So they decided not to give him tenure because of that. Well, they're at it again. This time, they have decided to rescind a fellowship from someone at Harvard, and that person is Kenneth Roth, who is also probably the most popular human rights activist in the country. Now, shout out to Betsy because she sent me this story. It says Harvard rescinds fellowship offer to leading rights activists. So this is Kenneth Roth. So Kenneth, they're doing him the same way that they did Cornel West. And I'm just going to read this top part and then I'm going to get into the interview because he had an interview on Democracy Now! And it says Kenneth Roth, who was the executive director of the Human Rights Watch, or HRW, until last year, was recruited by the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy to become a fellow, and he accepted. But a few weeks later in July, Roth said the center called and told him that the dean of the school, and that's Douglas, had not approved it. Now, I want to go ahead and get into the interview here with Democracy Now! And Kenneth Roth, but I do want to say this first. I think something that you have to understand about Harvard University, and I say this as someone who lives in the Boston area here in Massachusetts, and I've worked at Harvard University. With all of these universities, you first have to ask, who are their donors? Similar to politics, right? The higher education system follows a similar model to the US government. That's actually where it came from, where you have a president of the university, you have donors, just like politicians have donors, the board of trustees, you have your deans, you have your faculty, your staff, and your students, and then you have the service workers. And when you look at who donates to Harvard University, that may help you understand why they may have some of the views that they have. Now, by they, I don't mean the individuals, I mean the institution. Did you know that once upon a time, Harvard University actually participated in eugenics? They don't talk about that. Shh, that's a secret. I should do a show just about that one day. That could be like a special Sunday stream where I just tell you about that whole story. But if you know who the donors are and what the donors expect, then that could help you figure some things out. Jeffrey Epstein donated to Harvard University. Michael Bloomberg donated to Harvard University. Robert Kraft donated to Harvard University. And there's many, 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 many more. But the university, in order to keep those donors, they have to please those donors. Those donors can walk. They don't have to renew their donation. Let's get into this interview. I want you to hear from Kenneth Roth because, like I said, once again, Harvard is at it again and they need to be called out.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government is facing growing outcry for rescinding a fellowship for the former head of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, over his criticism and the group's criticism of Israel's human rights record. Ken Roth is one of the most recognized human rights defenders in the world. He headed Human Rights Watch from 1993 to 2022. In 2021, Human Rights Watch made headlines when it published a major report accusing Israel of committing crimes against humanity, including apartheid. In June, Ken Roth agreed to take a fellowship at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy inside Harvard's Kennedy School. But several weeks later, Roth learned Harvard Kennedy School Dean Douglas Elmendorf had vetoed the fellowship.
They want him to work in the human rights organization, but they only want him to talk about certain human rights. Depending on the country, they don't want you to talk about it. That's the problem. Let's go on.
Roth was told it was because he criticized Israel. The American Civil Liberties Union has called Harvard's decision to rescind the fellowship to Ken Roth, quote, profoundly troubling. PEN America has also criticized Harvard's decision, saying in a statement, quote, withholding Roth's participation in a human rights program due to his own staunch critiques of human rights abuses by governments worldwide raises serious questions about the credibility of the Harvard program itself, they said. Kenneth Roth joins us now from Geneva, Switzerland. Ken Roth, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what's happened, what you understand, why it is you are not at Harvard enjoying this fellowship.
Well, I mean, as you just said, it's because I and Human Rights Watch criticized Israel. The Carr Center, the Human Rights Center at the Kennedy School, wanted me. They called me up, as soon as I announced that I would be leaving Human Rights Watch. And it made sense for me to go there because I'm working on a book, and this would be a kind of very logical place for me to try to do that.
He should hook up with Cornel West. Maybe he already has spoken to him about this. But one thing I want to mention before we go on here is that, remember, they went after him. He didn't seek them out. They sought him out. So they invited him to come to the school through a fellowship. They gave the fellowship to him for him to come there. So you mean to tell me, again, I told you this guy's one of the most popular human rights advocates. They didn't do any research about his work, about what he believes, about how he feels. They didn't check to see if he had any speeches, anything. You could just Google. They didn't know what his beliefs and where he stood. They didn't know what that was before they invited him to come there and gave him the fellowship. I find that to be strange.
We thought that was the end of the story, that the dean's approval of my fellowship would be, a perfunctory matter. It happens all the time. And I was shocked when he vetoed it because of our criticism of Israel. I had a slight inkling of this when I spoke to the dean in July. He asked me after about a half hour, very pleasant, normal conversation. He said, "Do you have any enemies?" I thought it was a bit of a weird question because, as head of Human Rights Watch, I have a lot of enemies.
Right.
I mentioned to him that, the Chinese government and the Russian government have both personally sanctioned me. Governments like the Saudi government or the Rwandan government hate me. But, I knew what he was driving at. So I mentioned, yes, and of course the Israeli government hates me too. That was the end of the matter. 2 weeks later, I learned through the very respected professor at the Kennedy School, Catherine Sinkink, that Elmendorf, the dean, had told her that it was our criticism of Israel that was the death knell for my fellowship.
We need to say something here. Because he's not alone. Let's remember why Rising removed Katie Halper as guest host. This idea that you cannot critique the state of Israel, the government, we're not talking about individual people, but this idea that you can't even critique the government, an apartheid state, which is what they're trying to become, an apartheid state. You can't talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people. You can't offer any criticism there towards the government, towards the state of Israel. To me, that kind of comes across as authoritarian. Because who are you to tell people which government they can and cannot critique? Because at the end of the day, if you're looking at human rights abuses here, how are you going to say that one country is above that or one government is above that and everyone else is not? This is where we are in this country. This is where we are now. You see? Let's go on.
At Human Rights Watch for close to 30 years. Talk about Human Rights Watch stand on Israel, how it compares to Amnesty International's also did a big report on Israel as an apartheid state, but also your reports on Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Human Rights Watch applies the exact same standards to Israel as we do to 100 other countries that we regularly monitor. That is to say,
that's right. How are you going to be selective about human rights? Human rights only matter in certain places. Give me a break.
we insist on scrupulous, factual objectivity, and then we apply those facts under international human rights and humanitarian law. So the exact same process we use every place else. Because there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we also, as a matter of principle, scrutinize the other players in that conflict. So Human Rights Watch reports critically on the Palestinian Authority, on Hamas, on Hezbollah, and this is what we do in every other conflict around the world as well.
I also want to add too, and I did discuss this on RBN a couple weeks ago, it's not just the Palestinian people that are being treated that way in Israel. They're also doing this to Ethiopians in Israel as well. They're being treated with that same type of force. Get out of here. A lot of racism. If you look at some of the videos, follow Mint Press News on Twitter. They have a lot of video footage of this. It's just, they don't want, it's like basically like if you're not from there and you're not Israeli, it's like they're pushing people out. This is crazy shit. And you know why this is so dangerous? Because imagine if that ideology were to spread around the world. Imagine if another country starts to feel that way. Well, you know what? I don't like the fact that we have these refugees here. I don't like the fact that we have these immigrants here. Let's start pushing them out too. That's why it's so dangerous. Ay, ay, ay. I should see if I can get Kenneth on.
So there's really no difference between what Human Rights Watch does on Israel and every place else. The big difference is that there are a group of, organized supporters of the Israeli government, often masquerading around, behind sort of civic groups with very neutral sounding names, who attack anybody who criticizes Israel. And Human Rights Watch and me personally, we tend to be at the forefront of their attacks. Now, I don't think that's what was going on directly with the Kennedy School dean, but he easily could have read their material. Certainly since this decision was announced, these same groups have been saying, oh, Human Rights Watch is biased. But what they really mean is we hold Israel to the same standards as everybody else. They don't want, a few, somewhat fewer reports or maybe fewer tweets by me. They want no criticism of Israel. They want us to exempt Israel from human rights scrutiny. And no credible human rights group could possibly do that.
That's right. That's 100%. That's, I'm so glad he called it out. See, look, they have Ken all the way in Geneva. Ken had to go to Switzerland. I'm just kidding. He probably had a conference or something there, but this is the second time Harvard has done this within a year and a half. I'm disgusted that I worked at that place. I really am. Like, it's one of those things when I was there, when I was in it, I guess I just didn't see those things, but it's disgusting. Just knowing like this is the ideology that they have. Jesus.
Who do you believe is behind the pressure for you, for example, not to be a fellow at the Kennedy School? Do you believe it's donors to Harvard, and what kind of role do they play there?
Oh, snap. See, Amy, I'm surprised Democracy Now! Mentioned that, because I told you guys, you got to see who donates to the school, and then you'll understand why the school does the things that they do. You got to please those donors to keep them coming back for more. When the donors aren't happy and they don't renew their donations, that's a problem for the university. Listen, I've worked in higher ed for over 10 years. These universities, they're not schools. And I know that sounds silly when I say that, but they're really not. They've become a business. That's all it's about. It's just about making money. And if it's not for these Ivy League schools, even if you were to look at some of the athletic schools, if you look at schools like I went to University of South Carolina, big sports school, even those schools, they still trying to make money too. They just make it through the athletes. Why do you have some of these college football players making $1 million a year? How much does the coach of the University of Alabama make? It's all about money now. College used to be a place that you go to find yourself, to be creative and free and open. It's not that way. It is very much corporate. It is very much corrupt, and it's all about making money. That's what it has turned into. Go ahead, Ken.
I'm not hearing you if you're...
Oh, can you hear me now? I'm saying, do you believe donors to Harvard played a role in your rejection as a fellow?
Now you're coming back.
He may have a little bit of a connection issue because he's abroad.
Do you believe your role as a fellow? Do you believe that donors' roles to Harvard are a factor in your denial, the rescinding of your fellowship?
Well, I mean, I have no direct evidence of that, but I think it's the only plausible explanation. In other words, Elmendorf, the dean, he doesn't have a history of defending Israel. I don't think he personally cares. But as Michael Massing showed in his excellent expose in The Nation on this issue, the Kennedy School has a few big donors who are big supporters of Israel. And I think the real fear here is that, either he consulted with them or he feared what they would say, but he allowed their preferences to yield to his censorship. In other words,
let me just tell you something about the Kennedy School. Okay. Michael Bloomberg, who is a donor, Michael Bloomberg has an entire academic program named after him. Not kidding. That's how powerful some of these donors are. How you get a whole program named after you? What the fuck is this? Like, seriously? Very powerful. So I just want to disagree a little bit with Kenneth. I don't actually think the dean contacted the donors. I think it was probably the other way around. I think the donors contacted the dean. And I've seen this happen before too, working in higher ed, where our dean had made some decisions sometimes, and the donor contacted the dean and said that they would not be renewing their donorship because of a decision that was made. I can't get too much into it on here, but I think it may have been the other way around.
He apparently allowed donors to violate the principle of academic freedom. And this is a very serious problem. I mean, it's not just a problem for me personally. This is not, impeding my career in a significant way. But I think about, first of all, the younger academics who don't have, the visibility that I do, who are going to take from this lesson the view that if you touch Israel, if you criticize Israel, that can be a career-killing move. You'll get canceled. And that's a disastrous signal to send. But the other, I think, big issue here is that if there is any institution in the world, any academic institution that could resist this kind of donor pressure, it's Harvard. Harvard is, the richest university in the world. Harvard should be saying, we as a matter of principle will not accept contributions from donors who insist on violating academic freedom.
Harvard University, for those who are not aware, has the largest endowment in Massachusetts out of all the universities. I think MIT is second, but Harvard has the largest endowment. They have a lot of money.
They are not making that statement. Right now, they're just lying low and leaving us to have to surmise that it was this kind of donor pressure that led to this cancellation of my fellowship and this effort to really undermine academic freedom. I hope that Harvard takes this as an opportunity to clarify that donor preferences never will be allowed to violate academic freedom. But their silence so far says the opposite.
But Ken, I don't think, I'm going to have to, I'll see if I can reach out to Ken. Because honestly, Ken, I don't think that's going to happen. Money talks, and they'd rather continue to get that money than to not get that money. I hate to break it to Ken, but again, I worked there too. And I worked at MIT and I worked at Boston University. And I'm just here to tell you that money talks.
Peter Beinart had an interesting op-ed in the New York Times in August headlined, "Has the fight against anti-Semitism lost its way?" He said, quote, "Over the past 18 months, America's most prominent Jewish organizations have done something extraordinary. They've accused the world's leading human rights organizations of promoting hatred of Jews," Peter Beinart wrote. Talk about who these Jewish organizations are. Do you think they had anything to do with what happened to you? And your own background, your family in relation to the Holocaust?
I forgot to mention that Kenneth is Jewish, by the way. Just which makes this even crazier, okay? I forgot to mention that to you guys.
Well, I mean, first of all, me personally, I'm Jewish. My father grew up in Nazi Germany and fled in July 1938 to the United States. You know, I grew up hearing Hitler stories. That's a lot of why I went into the effort to defend human rights. It was sort of what I brought from that experience. So, you know, the accusation that I'm anti-Semitic is just ridiculous. But there is a real effort to redefine anti-Semitism to mean essentially criticism of Israel. Now, they don't say that explicitly. They say, oh, you're demonizing Israel. But,
There
you know,
you
of course, human rights advocacy is about demonizing abusive governments. When Human Rights Watch reports on abuses and publicizes them, we are trying to demonize governments around the world. That's what we do. That's how we shame governments and pressure them into changing. So to say, oh, we're demonizing Israel, therefore we're anti-Semitic, is basically saying, don't criticize Israel. And, you know, we're not going to fall for that ploy, but it worries me because it's cheapening the very important concept of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a real, vibrant threat. But if it is dumbed down to mean just any criticism of Israel, people are going to stop getting outraged about anti-Semitism and think, oh, this is just the abusive Israel government or its supporters trying to defend Israel. That it would be a shame for the effort to combat anti-Semitism.
I'm going to try to see if I can get in touch with Kenneth. If you want to watch the rest of that interview, it's on Democracy Now! Channel, and it's called Harvard Faces Outcry for Rescinding Post to Ex-Head of Human Rights Watch over criticism of Israel. So definitely check that out. Again, Betsy, thank you so much for letting me know about that story, because again, it's just another one. I'm like, here we go again. Another example of Harvard. At Kid, yes, the Harvard donors are making their own phone calls to the university leadership to ensure Harvard doesn't publicize or tell the truth about Israel government murdering Palestinians. There you go. Thank you for the super chat. Eric, do you think the American people will en masse support the Palestinian people? I remember in the 90s being all Israeli. Unfortunately, no, I don't think so, because mainstream media here heavily propagandizes the American people. And the narrative coming from mainstream media is that you are supposed to support the state of Israel. It's really sad, and thank you for this super chat as well. Not the best argument when you have to bribe and hold hostage legislatures, Israel. Bill says donor preferences have always been allowed to impact academic freedom all the way back to Rockefeller, 100%. These are things that I think people just don't realize.